Hey everyone, it's me, Dr. E, and I'm here to chat today about doing addendums in your notes to have compliant documentation for in your insurance carrier guidelines and what needs to be there and what doesn't, and when it's not there, what to do about that, and if it's something that has to be there, when to do addendums, what is the urgency to do that, and what sort of things you need to change, how you need to type it, how to create macros to do that in your system so that you can do that to make it as easy as possible. And I'm going to show you an example of what I had to do when I was being audited for some missing information that was in my notes that had to do not with documenting medical necessity, but with carrier documentation requirements. So this is going to be a two-part webinar. Becky Walter, who is our state insurance specialist for the UVCA, she is going to join me for part two, which is going to be in 2 days. So today's going to be a half an hour. And this is called, so when it's not in your notes, addendums done right, and when to reach out to a pro, because I also did that, and that did not have the best results either. So I want to share my experience with you for that. All right, so when to do an addendum. If you look, if you're watching this live, in the control panel, there's handouts and you can download the current Anthem PT guidelines, Blue Cross Blue Shield, as of October 2019. If you are catching this as a replay and you got here with a link, I should have included that link in the replay text so you can find it. And what ends up happening is every time, and the reason I chose Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield is because that is what I have particular expertise in, having been through an audit and helped doctors also go through audits, specifically here in Virginia for that. But for the most part, guidelines don't change a whole lot from carrier to carrier because they all tend to follow Medicare, as you probably heard specialists say that before. So you need to have your guidelines. And so when to do an addendum is when a required element of documentation is missing. And there's two instances when that might happen. And one of them is when an oversight is identified. So that might be something that is normally in your notes, or maybe a therapist or somebody in your office would normally put something in your notes about whether a therapy was done or not, and you catch it, and it is normally in your notes, and you catch it that it didn't get put in a certain day, you would go in and do an addendum to add it there. And that is less often the case than number two here, is when you are audited, because honestly, most docs, number one is 82% of chiropractors have non-compliant notes, and they don't do self audits, and they hope they're going to fly under the radar. And by the time they actually identify things that aren't in their notes, they're in the process of being audited, and now they have to figure out about what they can do an addendum for and what they can't and how to do that. So documentation can be broken down into two elements. First part of your documentation is substantiating medical necessity. The second part is documenting requirements of a carrier. Now, I've been poking around some EHR software websites in the past couple of weeks, and there's a statement that pops up in all of them that drives me crazy. And there's a huge problem with this, and that is, usually in the testimonials, some doc will say, I love this software because I can make it say whatever I want. I can customize it to have exactly the text that I want, exactly the content. It works with my technique, and that makes them happy. And they need to take that off their website, because chiropractors, especially if you've been practicing for a long period of time, you need to stop thinking about your notes as what you want to put into your notes for your purposes, because getting paid in compliant guidelines has to do what the insurance company wants, and whether you meeting that or not, and they don't care if you have anything in your notes aside from that. And if that kind of gets your hackles hackles up, you got to let that go. So I'm a 1991 Palmer graduate. I had paper notes and travel cards for the first 14 years of my practice. I loved paper notes and travel cards because I could look at it and see multiple dates of treatment and a span of care right in front of my eyeballs in the matter of a minute, and flipping it over. And that is not what documentation is about anymore. And I had resistance, as well as many docs still do, about, I want to put in my notes what I want to put there. And it's like, you do that and go cash. If you're billing insurance, you have a signed contract that you will comply with the carrier guidelines. And I am also not saying we all should do what insurance carriers say in the greater scheme of healthcare. Is there are serious issues with the delivery of healthcare in our country right now. What I'm trying to do is keep docs not from being audited, because insurance carriers have the right to audit you, because for all they know, you're in your office and you have a patient name on a little pad and a date and a check mark, and they don't know what your notes look like. So they audit you to check up to see what you're doing. And we all should be anticipating, coming up in the future, is that all notes are going to be audited to some extent as you're filing them. There are several insurance specialists, Lisi Massajuski West from Gold Star Medical Services. She says that and other specialists as well. So it's not about what you want to say. You need to have your guidelines. You need to see what the carrier wants you to say, and your notes have to be that, and get over that. So where do you find this info? That's the guidelines. And you need to do self-audits. So a self-audit is when you look at your notes once you have reviewed your guidelines, and look at your notes, you look at your guidelines. Does this say what this is asking for? All of it, not most of it, not due diligence, not I'm better than I was a year ago. And up until a few years ago, when I was audited, there was this impression in our profession that, well, if you show that you're trying, or that you're pretty close, or that you're better, then it'll be okay. And I'm here to tell you, it is not okay. And insurance carriers don't care if you're trying hard and still not doing the right thing. Insurance carriers are finding, number one, insurance carriers know that 82% of chiropractors are non-compliant. So odds are, if they audit 100 docs, 82 of them are going to have bad notes. And if they go back and retroactively ask you for money back by saying that you didn't document the therapies that you billed for, especially offices that bill multiple therapies, you have to do it right, or they can ask for that money back. And that's called, so that's a retroactive audit. They usually will audit you going back a year. So I got my audit letter in August of 2017. They went back to November 1st of 2016. And I had made a lot of changes in that time. But when I printed my notes out, they asked for 10 patients for 6 months. And they picked it wasn't random. It was the most heinous, horrible, flared up, the guy with brain trauma from a skateboard accident, who had epilepsy and got dropped on the emergency room floor. And those are the people that their system is going to pull up. And when I printed my notes out, I did not do self audits. I had never even read my guidelines. I had been to documentation workshops, but that's not enough. You have to understand your guidelines. And when I printed out my notes and read through them, it was about 850 pages. Number one is the most glaring error was things salting over, that from visit to visit to visit to visit, that and it was too much stuff. So it made it look like the things that I did change, you couldn't find them. And the other thing that was a glaring issue was patients were signing in on their own with their own subjective information. They sit on their iPad and click, 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 click. And some people do it in 4 minutes and some take 25 minutes. You know who I'm talking about. And I was not reviewing what they were putting in. and I was putting in my portion, and very frequently what I was saying was not jiving what they were saying, and it made me look like an idiot. Not the patient wasn't doing the right thing, but the patient might use a higher number but tell me they were getting better, and I would say they're getting better, and the subjective when you printed out a series of visits was getting worse. So we stopped having patients sign in with their own subjective because I did not want to allow my reimbursement rely on what somebody else was putting in my documentation. When your patients are putting their own subjective in, they are altering your signed notes. And do you want to give them the power to do that? The only way to find out something like that is to do a self audit. Do it on paper, kill a tree, because when you print it out, I guarantee you, and I have had docs confirm this for me, is that when you print it out, it's not as good as you think that it is. And you see a lot of noise. If there's stuff in your notes that it does not have to be there for insurance purposes, take it out. Start deleting content. And that's one of the issues with documentation workshops. Often docs will go and like, oh my gosh, I have to put so much more into my notes and I'll never be able to keep up. And it's like, and workshops usually won't tell you when you put, they tell you all the things you need to put in, but what they don't say is make sure you delete the stuff that doesn't have to be there for them, and you don't absolutely have to need it for yourself. It doesn't need to be there, take it out, because the more concise your notes are, the more the carriers and the reviewers will be able to see the content they need to see, and it won't be all hidden, the less you have to update. So, but you must be proactive. Make a note to yourself and hand it to your staff and say, pick out whatever your major carrier is, 2 patients, and print out 3 months worth of care for those patients on paper, and then sit down at a coffee shop and you just go through page after page after page once you've reviewed your guidelines and or have your guidelines sitting there. So find your weak spots. This is the only way you can do it. And trust me, if you have to fix your notes because of missing content, you don't want to be doing it while you're being audited and while you're not being paid, because it is awful to do that. So look for missing required elements. Here's your guidelines. Specifically functional data, activities of daily living, not pain scales, not it's insurance carriers. If you look at the guidelines for medical necessities, you have to be able to document functional deficiencies that you can help improve, and your care plan is based on the scores on their testing, whether you use your oswestries or whatever test you are keeping track of that. And once somebody has reached maximum functional improvement, you need to release them to maintenance care, even if they might have 30 visits per year under their plan, and they've hit their max at 17 and you cannot substantiate continuing that care, they are now out of pocket after that day, no matter how many visits they have on their plan. Their maintenance care, you need to bill it as a maintenance visit, and it is not covered under like 99.9% of the policies. You need to have your care plan, you need to have a release date, you need to have your provider info identified. So for example, in my office, we had massage therapists that we were signing, they had their own, I created macros that they signed in. So not only was my note signed, but their note was signed. The text in the massage therapist documentation was my text that I put there. All they had to do was click on the macro button and identify the areas that they worked on, that of course collaborated with what I did. But remember what I said about with patients and having subjective information, and that is now part of your note. And do not let your reimbursement rely on what that patient did. Do not let your reimbursement for therapy, for example, massage therapy, rely on what your therapist may or may not put in there. Do not leave that to chance. So, all right, high horse, subjective conflicts with doctor input. I just mentioned that. On site, so how much is missing? So I have been doing some on sites locally for some friends, one who got an audit letter, and she knows I've been doing this for about a year, and she's sat in on one of my longer webinars, and we've had this conversation about guidelines, and she's texted me over the weekend, oh my God, I got a letter. So I said, I will come to your office. Let's look at your notes. Let's look at your macros. Let's see what the printed stuff is. Let's look at the patients that they asked for. And I have said in other blog posts on my site that most chiropractors, if they're non-compliant, which is most chiropractors, they're not non-compliant by missing like one or two little elements. Usually if they're non-compliant, they are completely oblivious to what their guidelines are asking for, and they're probably missing 20 or 30 things that need to be there. And she said, well, what can I do? Can I do addendums? Which is why we're having this conversation. So I went and looked at her notes, and she was one of those 20 or 30 things wrong in the notes docs, and you can't do addendums for entire visits. There has to be a reason. There, you have to have some external source that you're referring to that said you can't just like fix it after the fact. Your note should be signed within 48 hours, preferably on the day that you do that, as well as your therapist. You can't just rebuild them out of the blue at a later date and say this is an addendum. So once you have identified missing elements, I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. So when a signed note, what an addendum is, when a signed note is opened, information is added, and the note is re-signed. So like I just said, you have to have your note signed within 48 hours. Odds are, you look at your guidelines and it will tell you. When you do an addendum, you are opening up a signed note, you are putting new content in, and you are re-signing it with that date, which means you've lost the original date. If you're doing an addendum 6 months later, yes, that means now your note looks like it's signed 6 months later, which could be problematic, as you can imagine. So, so this is what I did, is I created, so in my instance, I will tell you, in my case of my audit, I actually had, when I finally got the audit report, over half of the reviewers' denials for my dates of service were wrong. The reviewers were wrong, which is, and I'm still, it's a year and a half later, and I'm still fighting that, and I'm still going to fight it, get my money back, and have a grievance filed and all that sort of stuff. But the main thing that was missing in my notes is I had massage therapists. I had my macro button that they hit, they signed in, they hit the macro button, it populated the text. They put the areas in for that patient and they signed it. Well, my carrier guidelines say that the provider's credentials must be included as part of the signed notes. So even though my therapist, I have their license number and expiration dates and their malpractice insurance, and it's on file at the office like it always has been, it required that that license number and expiration date be inside the signed note. So I had to create an addendum button. And what's good about it, by having a macro button, if you once you've identified weak spots in your notes, create a macro button with the text for each of those items. That way you don't have to type the whole thing all over again. You hit your macro button, and there should be a place to have a date where it does a calendar select. And I would, so note the originally, and so I would always note the originally signed date in the addendum. And the next slide, I believe, is a picture of one of those addendums. So while I was in audit, however, and I was disputing the reviewer errors, and I didn't want them to say, well, hey, you could have just changed it and sign them later. I actually printed the original note prior to doing the addendum with the original date stamp on there. And you can also save them to a PDF and put it in a special place in the file, or you can put it in the patient's file. Do the addendum, which re-signs it with a new date on it, but you have proof of the old one that you didn't go in and fix 20 other things, because they don't know if you fixed 20 other things. All right. So here we go. So here is one of my, this is the credentials. You can see my name and the date that I signed this date of service, which was 6/5/2018, and that's the date that the patient came in. And then my therapist shows up separately because she signs in herself, and when it prints out is both of us have a date and time stamp on our signature. The amendment This is specifically to add therapist credentials to an existing handwritten note. This is before we transition to the electronic notes. Per documentation request, please refer to the original scanned therapist note for all treatment details, start and stop time, etc. The original hand notes were signed on 6/4/2018. Virginia State Certified Massage Therapist, Althea, license number, expiration date. And now this, we did that addendum on, you can see the date, May 15th, 2019, because being in, you, trust me, you never want to be audited until let's say everything is perfect. Because in my case, I mean, as far as not getting paid for something, yes, technically this is in the documentation requirements by Anthem, but considering non-compliant notes have really relevant stuff that's missing, this was really splitting hairs, but that's the guidelines. So that's how I did my addendum. I create a macro button. If you have multiple issues that tend to pop up, for example, if you do intersegmental traction, but you don't always state the therapeutic purpose for that intersegmental traction or the length of time, then you create a different macro button in your system, and then you can just hit that and paste it in, and then re-sign it. All right, so what happens to the EHR record when you do this? So I talked to several people, and several people told me different things. And I even Brian Weisman at ChiroTouch, which is the software that I was using, I even may have another conversation with him. We've had several conversations about this kind of stuff, about perhaps having an option to have an addendum date stamp or something, because when you print it out and you mail it off, it has, so that last note that I just showed you has Althea's signature on for May 15th, 2019, which was almost a year after the date of service. I had one specialist tell me that inside the software workings of ChiroTouch, that there is a data track, and that if it ever went to court, that they could pull up from the innards of the saved information that that was changed. I did not confirm that with ChiroTouch. I had another one that just says, well, insurance companies will take your word for it if that's what you say, that that's all that you did. I am reticent to give insurance companies any slack, that they're going to give us any slack. So that's why I like doing what I did as far as printing out the original or saving the original to a PDF. All right, I'm gonna, before I start talking about the professionals, is I'm gonna talk a little bit more about, well, okay, I wanna jump this, that popped out of my head. So outside professional, what do you need? So while I was in the middle of my audit, and what ended up happening with me and at least 45 other docs in our state, was we weren't given the reasons for denial. So we were all sort of in this pending holding. We were all mailing off our notes. When you're in prepayment review, you're sending off paper claim forms, you're sending off every printed note that has to do with that date of service from whoever treated that patient that day, and then the carrier gets to review them. And I believe they can take up to 90 days to do that, which means you're not going to get paid till it's reviewed. So what ended up happening is a whole bunch of us docs were in limbo, pending, and not really having any feedback. And you're not getting paid. If depending on how insurance dependent your office is, that can be paralyzing to your cash flow. And I decided to reach out to one of the big reviewing companies. I said, well, in the meantime, I know my notes are pretty good. Let me see what they say. And this is before I really did a deep dive in guidelines note. This is because you are totally capable of doing that in your office. You just have to set aside the time to do it, and that it's important enough, and it is, because you can't fly under the radar anymore. It's very common for these companies to offer a 3-file review. They'll say, we want to look at a Medicare note, we want to look for an in-network carrier note, and an out-of-network carrier note. And cash they don't worry about, because cash you don't have to worry about so much. I didn't need that. So if you have a main carrier that you're concerned about, I actually sent a query and talked to people, and I ended up paying for this 3-file review, and it took 3 weeks to schedule somebody, 3 weeks more of not getting paid, for me to really say, I don't need a Medicare review. I don't need a non-participating carrier credit review. I need this. I need Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield in Virginia right now. You need to look at my documentation, and they tend to grade you. And so going on 3 weeks to a month in, they finally did that, and I had a retired chiropractor going through the notes, gave me a B plus, which, you can have everything in there except for one thing. Like for me, insurance care and the massage therapist credentials. Didn't matter if everything else was perfect. They're not going to pay you for. They're looking for that one thing to not pay you. All right. So some companies offer an annual service plan. Some companies offer a 3-file review. There is usually an option for an hourly consultation fee. And they didn't know exactly what I needed because people didn't ask for what I was asking for. So I paid for, it was $9.99 for a chunk of doing a 3-file review and some other service. And we ended up converting that to hourly consultation because I had this one specific thing to work with. It ended up, I got a refund. I ended up using up 2 hours of that time altogether. And I said, well, good. I want my money back for the rest of it because I didn't need the rest of it. I just needed that one thing. But I tell you what, B plus is not good enough. And you need to be very clear what you need. And you talk to person after person after person if that's what you want, because a lot of places don't offer that right yet, and they need to start doing that. So that's what you need to ask for. All right. So what does a grade mean? So this needs to be meaningful to you. So don't say, yay, I got a B plus, because you need to know what's not there. And because that one thing that's not there, it doesn't matter if you have a B plus or an F, both of them, you're not paid, if that makes sense. So it needs to be meaningful to you, and that is, it needs to tell you what's not there. And if there's one little thing that's not there, you need to fix that thing, or two things. Don't think I have 95% else is great, so I'm good. You're not good. They're looking for that one thing to not pay you. All right. So don't be complacent. It's not good enough. A professional does not take the place of you doing the work. And honestly, if you print your guidelines, and you understand them and you release all of that drama that may be going on in your head about how it's like, oh, I should just go cash, or this is BS, or whatever it is, because a lot of my colleagues have that going on. I did. Raise my hand. I did too. You got to let that go. Say, for example, you had somebody that you paid to come work on your roof of the house, and you're going to pay them $3,000, and they decide to fix your gutters instead. It's like, no. So really carry your guidelines for better or for worse. This is what they want. That's what you need to give them. Anything else that needs to be in your notes is, if there's something that you need there for you to see from visit to visit, then you put that in there. Make it as brief as possible, because everything that's in there needs to be updated, because it salts over and there's a lot of stuff that repeats and repeats. It looks really bad when you get audited. All right. I hope that makes sense. You're totally capable of doing this yourself. In fact, you're probably better capable of doing this yourself. You just have to dot all the I's, make a bullet list. Everything's got to be there. Chances are you probably have to upgrade your macros with your software company. Chances are, if you have, and I did a blog post on this, look on my site, it's me, Dr. E /blog. I did about the EHR macros. Is the more like that, if you've customized your macros to where it says what you want to say, the less likely you are to ever update your macros, because all that customization goes away. And that was, like I said, they even advertise their testimonials. It says exactly what I want it to say. It does not need to say that. It needs to say, if you're filing insurance, what your carrier wants it to say. So if you need to upgrade your macros, that means you have to go through the trainings. You need to rewatch the videos, how to use those macros. Ask your company, what have you done to help my macros create compliant documentation? And if they can't answer that, you need to find yourself a new software company. But and I can only speak for ChiroTouch because that was my experience. Is the current one, if you are trained and you use the macros like they built them out, and they had assistance from Kathy Mills Chang at KMC University, you have everything you need right there. And I sold my office. And when I did, I had docs reaching out to the new owner, said, "Can I have her macros?" Because they knew I was compliant. It's like, I am just using what was already built. I'm not using any old stuff. I'm not using customized stuff. I'm using what they built to help me do this. The only thing I customized was the addendum buttons, and I also created my therapists as providers inside the system, and I created macro buttons for them so that their notes were what I wanted to say and substantiated medical necessity, because that's your goal. All right, so that's part one. Thanks for joining me. Part two will be with Becky Walter, who is the UVCA insurance specialist, who has credentials and who does this, who does sit down and help with the notes. And Becky and I first, and the reason I invited her to be on this is after I went through that issue with the 3 file thing and paying for the wrong thing and having to ask for money back, is she said, you know what? She's the one who said they don't offer that. Is the specialists do that don't offer that, because it's a very specific thing, but it's a very necessary and needed thing in the face of audits, and she knows what I'm talking about. So we're going to talk in more detail about that, and when getting a professional to step in will help, and she does offer that service. So again, thanks for joining me. This will be replay, and check out some of my blog posts. It's me, Dr. E, /blog. I have It's Me, Dr. E on Facebook. I post there. And if you don't know where to start, if you have been to that documentation seminar or workshop and you have realized, oh my God, I have 20 or 30 things to fix, and you sit down at your computer on Monday morning and with every intention of fixing everything, and you don't know where to start, and it's overwhelming, and because you cannot fix everything all at once. Believe me, you cannot fix it all at once. If you need triage, what I have my documentation boot camp, and what that is an implementation plan for when you're going, what you're going to do, and how long it's going to take, and how to shift your office from being and your notes from being non-compliant to compliant. All right. Well, thank you for joining me. I am going to